An international progressive group has issued a warning now that Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro appears to be in the process of a Trump-style insurrection or possibly even a military coup ahead of next year's election. Now, before I get into that warning and what it says and the march that took place today and what that march was about, I want to first discuss why this is happening. Why is Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro even attempting to steal next year's election before it even happens? Well, obviously, it comes down to poll numbers. Much like Donald Trump and the way that election looked before election day 2020, Jair Bolsonaro is looking at the numbers and realizing that he is not going to win unless he tries something like this. So this here from Common Dreams. Recent polls put Bolsonaro's approval rating at a historically low 23%, as he faces a series of massive protests and calls for impeachment over his administration's mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic, corruption scandals, a weakening economy, and accusations of genocide and ecocide for his exploitation of the Amazon and disregard for the nation's indigenous people. With Brazil's Independence Day observed on September 7th, critics warn Bolsonaro is exploiting the national holiday to stir his base and further entrench hostility to the nation's democratic systems. So we'll get to more on what Bolsonaro did today in this march. But before I do that, let's get a little deeper into these numbers. So 23% approval rating is abysmal. And looking at his top competition, Lula da Silva, it's clear that Bolsonaro is scared. So this is a recent poll from Ipsos showing Lula, if he were to run, he hasn't formally announced yet, but if he were to run against Bolsonaro, that he would win in the first ballot with 56% support to Bolsonaro at 26%. If it were just between the two of them on a second ballot, Lula would win with 70% support with Bolsonaro down at 30%. So Bolsonaro is seeing these numbers and realizing that he's not going to win next year's election unless he does something like try and steal it, which of course is what he's trying to do, starting with the voting system. So he recently failed in his bid to reform the voting system. More here from AP. Electoral authorities and even many of Bolsonaro's political allies oppose the proposal, saying the system is fully reliable and the change could create opportunities for vote buying. Critics contend Bolsonaro is trying to sow doubt among his passionate supporters about the 2022 election results, setting the stage for potential conflicts similar to those spawned by then U.S. President Donald Trump's allegations of fraud in the U.S. So you can see here some clear similarities between what Trump tried in 2020 and what is still going on with the whole discussion around that election, and what Bolsonaro is trying to do with his own base in Brazil. And if you look at, I mean, the comparison is so direct that they even had Trump administration veteran Jason Miller visiting Jair Bolsonaro and his son Eduardo in the presidential palace 2 days before the planned insurrection. So that's the big march that I'll get to that's going on today. Notice the Brazilian president, who is a millionaire, honing his barefoot, simple man of the people image. Ridiculous. So this is, again, attempting to be the everyman by putting on a display like this, standing in bare feet. But in reality, he's not at all the everyman, and he's trying to steal the next election. Now, before even going any further, just to be clear here, when it comes to Lula, so I've covered Lula several times. He's a former president of Brazil. There was obviously, a lot over the past few years with Lula. He was thrown into prison over trumped-up charges over corruption. That's a whole other story. But Lula, when he was president, lifted millions in Brazil out of poverty. One of the most successful working-class leaders in the world, which is why his popularity is so large right now and why he's a major threat, the major threat to Bolsonaro trying to win re-election next year. But going back on this, I mean, you even had Trump Jr. here due to Hurricane Ida. Donald Trump Jr. canceled his trip to Brazil for yesterday's rally for the September 7th insurrection called the Conservative Political Action Conference. Instead, he gave a speech remotely saying China has big plans for next year's elections in Brazil. So they're trying the exact same thing that they did in the U.S., trying it trying it in the South in Brazil. Now, let me get to, I'm going to show some video from the march in a second here, but and how underwhelming it may have been. But first here, let's get to the warning that was sent out by Progressive International. So they have the headline here, and of course I'll link to this below the video. saying, quote, "We are gravely concerned about the threat to Brazil's democratic institutions. Over 150 parliamentarians, ministers, and ex-presidents from 26 countries warn of Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro's plans for an insurrection on September 7th. So that's happening right now. They sent this warning out saying, in part here, President Bolsonaro has escalated his attacks on Brazil's democratic institutions in recent weeks. On August 10th, he directed an unprecedented military parade through the capital city of Brasilia as his allies in Congress pushed sweeping reforms to the country's electoral system, widely considered to be one of the most trustworthy in the world. Bolsonaro and his government have threatened several times to cancel the 2022 presidential elections if Congress fails to approve these reforms. So you can see here with these sorts of threats that this is Brazil here potentially on the verge of a crisis if Bolsonaro does what he can to actually be successful in a insurrection or potentially a military coup to try and steal the next election. And of course, the absurdity of this happening on Brazilian Independence Day, September 7th, where he is trying to steal an election from Lula da Silva next year. Now, also worth mentioning here, it brings up his allies. Bolsonaro's allies, in case you haven't, followed him too closely over the past couple of years, we're talking about white supremacists, military police, authoritarians, people that are climate change deniers, COVID deniers, vaccine deniers, far right culturally and far right economically. We are not talking this. He'll pretend to be a working class leader with pictures like this with no shoes on, but the reality is this is somebody who protects the wealthy, the powerful, and much like Trump, does so under the guise of pretending to be for the working class, but never actually does anything for the working class, which is why you see Trump allies in his orbit here. And also Steve Bannon has also had a huge impact and a huge has been a huge supporter of Bolsonaro and has had an impact in Brazil and on Bolsonaro as well. Now, one last thing. So the march, this attempted insurrection, this is going to be an ongoing story. If anything comes out of this, I'll cover it later on in the week. But here you have journalist from Brazil, Khalil Oliveira, tweeting out here in translated from Portuguese, saying demonstration in Brasilia far below expectations, with supporters coming from all over the country. Anti-democratic acts instigated by President Bolsonaro do not reach a significant audience in view of the mobilization made for the 7th of September. See the video below. So here is basically saying that the turnout is much lower for this Bolsonaro-supported insurrection. It's much lower than suspected or than expected. So let me play this quick clip here for you to see I guess the size of the crowd. And this is, looking at this, very similar to Trump in 2016 or his inauguration in early 2017. Very similar here in terms of having this, this long stretch of land and only a small portion of it covered in people. But again, this may have changed over the course of the day, but this is what was taken at the time.
Vamos dizer assim, num dos gramados, desses quadrados que a gente vê na imagem grandes, um dos gramados aqui da esplanada dos ministérios é onde essa manifestação acontece. Como o Valdo já tinha tentado explicar, e agora a imagem permite, né, Valdo, a gente conversando aqui, o bloqueio funciona tá aqui, ali. Né? Isso, o presidente está nesse caminhão ali.
Caminhão ali.
All right, so even though I'm half Portuguese, I do not speak the language, unfortunately, so I cannot translate that for you. But it's clear there from the images that the crowd is much smaller than what that strip of land would have allowed. So, not to say Bolsonaro doesn't have support. Obviously he does, but it is, a lot of it is concentrated in that space because when you look at polling, up to compared to Lula da Silva, and it's not just one poll, all polls show Lula da Silva way ahead of Bolsonaro if he were to run against him. And it's because of Bolsonaro's destruction over the past several years, and especially, I would imagine, because of COVID and how Bolsonaro completely just did not take it seriously. So this is going to be a story that we're going to have to continue keeping an eye on, and it, again, potentially here on the verge of a crisis if Jair Bolsonaro is successful in his attempted coup.